Welcome to 99 zu 1. Today we are talking to Søren Mau about his book Mute Compulsion. In German it has been released by Dietz Verlag. It's called Stummer Zwang. I'll say a couple of things about the book in a second, but before I do that I will introduce our guest. Søren Mau is a communist philosopher who specializes in Marxist theory. He recently finished a research project about Marxism and the body funded by the Independent Research Fund Denmark, and in September 2022 he will begin a new research project with the title A Philosophical Anthropology for the Capitalist Scene, funded by the Carlsberg Foundation. He's a member of the board at the Danish Society for Marxist Studies, an external examiner in philosophy at Danish universities, and writes for the Danish newspaper Information. You can find him on www.soren, so it's written with a normal O in this case, sorenmau.com, and you can also contact him over, well, I'll send that email address in the description of this video. So a couple of words to this book. This book is the attempt at giving an overview of, basically it's a study trying to give an overview on the one hand, on works and research, Marxist research on economic power and capitalism, and Søren gives his own spin to that. It's a pretty amazing book. It's like one of the best things I've written in recent years, so you should definitely check this out. The way that he is able to, display all these controversies and discussions that have been going on in Marxist research regarding the question of economic power, boil them down to really their core contradictions, and then at the same time give his own spin to that and take his own position, which is distinct from all of them, or most of them. That is really, really impressive. So I really hope that you, after this interview, get this book. There is also an English version if you want to read it in English, of course. And with that, I welcome our guest, Søren Mau.
Thank you.
Welcome to 99 zu 1, Søren. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine, thank you. And how are you?
Good, good. We had a couple of great weather days in Berlin. That's
nice.
Not very often, at least in this time. Let's see. But yeah, no, I'm looking forward to this talk, and we don't have so much time today, so I would like to immediately get started and ask you the first question. The subtitle of your book is A Marxist Theory of Economic Power of Capital, which to some might sound surprising, especially people that are vaguely familiar with Marxist literature and research. After all, didn't Marx and later Marxists and also post-Marxists already explain plenty about how capitalist power, economic power and capital works, for example, through ideology and violence? How do we have to understand your particular work in relation to all these elaborations?
Well, yes, you are absolutely right. A lot of Marxists have written and said a lot of good things about the power of capital and power relations and forms of domination in capitalism. And I think that I think of my book as a supplement to all of that. And I think a lot of great things have been written about power in capitalism, and but I also think that there's still room for some improvements. And I think that there has been a tendency in the Marxist tradition to focus on the two forms of power that you just mentioned, namely violence and ideology. And I also think that we could say that there has been a tendency in the Marxist tradition, or at least in large parts of the Marxist tradition, because there are, of course, a lot of exceptions to that, but a tendency to work from an assumption that power basically has two forms, two basic fundamental forms that all exercises of power can be reduced to, and those two forms are violence in the sense of physical coercion, and on the other hand, ideological power. And I think this distinction, we can find this distinction in many different forms in different writers and thinkers. So some Marxists have tended to focus a lot on the the way in which capitalism relies on coercive power and physical violence, especially the violence exercised by the state. So that tradition, or that part of the Marxist tradition, has focused on how the power of capital, or how capitalism relies on the coercive power of the state. And that is, of course, an important thing to notice and to write about. And I don't want, you know, I would say that the violence of the state is absolutely necessary for the reproduction of capitalism. Right. So I'm not trying to say that that's not important. And then there's another part of the Marxist tradition that has focused a lot on ideological power, in contrast to the coercive power. In a theory like Althusser, Louis Althusser, and his theory of ideology, it's very, this distinction is very clear, because he distinguishes between the coercive, the repressive state apparatuses and the ideological state apparatuses. And I think that's that scheme is very, we find that in a lot of different Marxist thinkers. And what I want to do with my book is to say that in addition to these two forms of power, which are obviously important and also necessary for the reproduction of capitalism, there is also a third form of power, which is what I call economic power, or mute compulsion, which I think is and I argue that it's a irreducible form of power, in the sense that we cannot reduce it to a form of violence or ideology. And that it is a form of power which is plays a central role in the reproduction of capitalism, so that we cannot understand how capital is able to reproduce its grip on society without understanding this form of power, which is an abstract and anonymous and impersonal form of power. And perhaps I should add straight away that it's, I think particularly for, you know, is speaking in a German context, you know, this is not my idea, in the sense that it's not something I discovered or anything like that. It is, right. There's a lot of Marxist literature about this already, but I just think that I, you know, had some things to add to that.
And I mean, even in Marx, right? So I mean, the word stummer Zwang, at least I have never read it in English, but probably also mute compulsion then comes from Marx's writing himself. So he was
it's an expression that he uses in Capital, in the final sections of the first volume of Capital. Yeah. So the title of my book is a quote from Marx.
Right. And I mean, to that extent, you would think that this would be, let's say, there would be a more coherent theory, or a research program devoted to this particular term, because it's used in some locations somewhat, on the side and not so central, but it seems to be very, very central to many of his arguments. So why do you think it is that in the last 150 years we don't really have produced, by we I mean Marxists, don't really have produced a coherent theory of economic power of capital?
Well, to be honest, I'm not sure I have a good answer to that question. I think one reason could perhaps be that a lot of the writings by Marx, which would be relevant for such a theory, or where you can find a lot of his thoughts on this, have only been published quite late in the 20th century. So I think that's perhaps one reason why earlier Marxists didn't pay as much attention to it. But I think probably the most important reason is that I think it has something to do with historical context. I think that there were a lot of good reasons, I think, why the Marxists of the Second International Era, the classical Marxists from that time, tended to focus so much on the state and the violence and the centrality of state violence in the reproduction of capitalism. And I think that's because that era of imperialism, it was perhaps the violence of the state was more central to the reproduction of capitalism, and more central also for the revolutionary struggle in that period, perhaps. So I think that there were some, the historical context is important here, and I think there were probably good reasons to why they tended to focus a lot on that. And then later, the question of ideology was raised. I think the rise of theories of ideologies had a lot to do with the rise of fascism in Europe, and
right.
Attempts to explain support for fascism and popular support for nationalism around World War I and so on. And I think that that's also an example of how there were particular historical circumstances which made it more important to focus on some forms of power rather than others.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. So let's go into your book a little bit. You in the German version, which is a little bit different than the English book, at least from structure, you structured the whole thing in 3 parts. That is the same in the English one. The 3 parts are first conditions, where you basically talk a little bit about the conditions that underlie the elaborations you wanna do afterwards, and then you talk about the relations that are important to understand in order to understand economic power in capitalism, and in the end you address dynamics. Let's go into the conditions. And I have many questions here. I think I could really, we could fill a couple of episodes with just this chapter, because it was very exciting. But I think for the sake of this interview, we should give a short definition on what we mean by power. So, I mean, you discussed this extensively. You also go into, Foucault's definition of power and elaboration on these. You also discuss Hegel's idea of subjectivity and how that might be applied in capital. Without going into too much details of these kind of elaborations, can you tell us how you, for the purpose of your work, would define power, or economic power, let's say?
Yes, of course. And but actually, I don't define power in a general sense, because in order to do that, I would have to go into a lot of discussions that are not immediately relevant for defining what the power of capital would mean. So in the first chapter of the book, I'm concerned with understanding what that expression means, the power of capital, and how does it make sense to speak of the power of capital. Because the thing is that most theories of power argue that power is something that we can only attribute to, or the exercise of power or having power is something that we can only attribute to persons or subjects or agents or actors or something like that. So in order to work with a concept of or with the notion or the expression, the power of capital, we would then have to argue that capital can, in a meaningful sense, be described as a subject or an agent or an actor or something like that. So I discuss these things, and I, for example, discuss the attempts to understand capital as a subject in a Hegelian sense. But I ultimately argue that I don't think that it makes sense to say that capital is a subject or is an actor or an agent. But at the same time, I also insist that it does make sense to speak of the power of capital. So, what I do is instead of concluding that capital is a subject, I argue that we should not restrict the concept of power to designate a relationship only between social actors or persons or subjects, but that power can also be a relationship between social actors and emergent properties of social relations. And I think that capital can be seen as an example of that. And so capital, I describe capital as a social logic, in the sense that it's a way of using things. So capital is not it's not a specific class of things. It's not a type of thing. It's a way of using things, and anything that can take on the commodity form, which means everything that can be bought or sold, can be used as capital, and if you use anything to for buying and selling with the aim of making a profit, then it's capital. So capital is a way of using things, and in that sense, it's a social logic. And I try to extend the power, the concept of power, to be able to encompass, for example, a social logic. So I define the power of capital as capital's capacity to impose its logic on social life. So that's my definition of the power of capital, and that is compatible with a lot of different definitions of power in general. It's compatible, for example, with one of Foucault's definition, which is that he writes somewhere that, in a famous quote, that the exercise of power is a conduct of conducts and a management of possibilities. So that's one general concept of power that is compatible with the concept of the power of capital as I describe it.
One of your conditions that you elaborate is the concept of a social ontology of economic power. So for some people that are not maybe so well versed with this term, maybe you can give us a quick explainer on what that means, or ontology even means, that word. And then in particular, I would like to, because I think this is important to understand a couple of key concepts, at least that's how it clicked for me. This concept of the human species, or Gattungswesen, species being, maybe it's called in English, I'm not sure. And how it is important to understand human nature in order to understand later how economic power can exert itself onto humans and society. So can you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Yes, of course. Well, ontology in the classical definition is the doctrine of being as being. So one could maybe say that ontology is the theory of a philosophical discipline that concerns itself with the most fundamental structures of reality, the most fundamental aspects of reality. That's one way to put it, I think. And so social ontology would then be the doctrine of a particular kind of being, namely the social or social being. So I think the fundamental question of a social ontology would be, what is the nature of social reality? What is the social, and what kind of being is it or does it have? So I don't try to provide a social ontology as such. In general, what I try to do is to come up with a social ontology of economic power. So that means that I try to explain the phenomenon of the economic power with references to some of the fundamental aspects of social reality. So one could perhaps say that the question I try to answer in those chapters is, what is it about the social that allows such a thing as economic power to exist? Why is it even possible for human beings to organize their reproduction as a species through such a form of abstract and anonymous domination? And that requires a discussion of, for example, the social nature of human beings. So I go into all the debates in the Marxist tradition about human nature and what role the concept of human nature, or the essence of the human being, plays for the Marxist theory of history and critique of capitalism. And I, in many respects, I agree with Louis Althusser and also Michael Heinrich and their critique of the early Marx, which the early Marx relied on a concept of human nature as a basis of critique. So in the sense that he criticized capitalism in the name of human nature, in the sense that that his primary criticism of capitalism was that it contradicted human nature, and I think he later he broke with such a criticism, and I agree with, you know, it's a very well-known position in these debates, and I broadly agree with that. But I also think that didn't lead to, you know, that doesn't mean that the concept that there's no idea of human nature in Marx's later works, and I think that there are some very useful thoughts about that in Marx's later works. Yeah.
Right. Can you tell us a little bit about what that new human nature is then? In the,
yeah,
it's a question that it's not easy to be answered, I know, but maybe explain a little bit of these concepts that you.
Of course. Well, I think the central thing is that I think that in Marx's later writings we find a very useful concept of human nature as something that is fundamentally unfinished, in a sense. That perhaps we could, or a more precise way to put it is that the characteristic thing about the human being is that it has an underdetermined relationship to its surroundings. So the human being is a natural being, which means that it has to maintain a constant metabolism with the rest of nature. But and the human being is an inherently social being, which means that that this metabolism with the rest of nature is always a social process. But the thing is that there's no natural way to organize this. There's no immediately given way. The human nature doesn't imply a specific social form of this metabolism. So in that sense, and I think that has something to do with the structure of the human body and the way that the human body has evolved in an evolutionary sense, and or through evolution, which has resulted in this peculiar species that doesn't really have that is biologically underdetermined.
What do you mean by underdetermined? Yeah, sorry.
So it means that there's no, that the human being has to, humans have to make sure that a metabolism exists and is maintained through social processes, but the specific social form of that is never immediately given. So in a way we could say that the human being is an inherently political creature, or a political being, and I think that actually means that it's never possible to say that a certain mode of production is in contradiction to human nature, for example. And it's also impossible. So I don't think that, you know, there are a lot of good ways to criticize capitalism, and I don't think that it's true to say that capitalism contradicts human nature. And I also don't think that communism would be a realization of human nature. And I also think that such a form of critique would be actually a kind of depoliticization, because it amounts to measuring a historically specific social form against like a natural, apolitical, non-political natural fact. So yeah.
No, I really like that part when you went a little bit into this kind of anthropological elaboration of, I'm using that word elaboration too much, where you talk about how humans are inherently, and that's I think also part of what you meant by underdetermined, which is we basically need tools to survive, and we kind of need organization or, you know, a social life to survive, and in this way we are kind of different from other animals, let's say, that okay, they can also use tools, but they are not dependent on these kind of tools, and I think you call this the extension of the body, right? And there's some kind of alienation actually happening there. Sorry, please go ahead.
Well, yeah, the tools are absolutely central, and Marx famously approvingly quotes Benjamin Franklin's definition of the human being as a tool-making animal. And Marx talks of tools as organs, And I think that we should try to take that metaphor, if it is a metaphor, I'm not sure, but take that serious. That tools are actually a kind of organs. So the human being, instead of having organs that are specialized and functionally related to a particular kind of environment, the human species has evolved in a way where we are, instead of having these specialized organs, we have tools which are, or technology which is basically a kind of externalized organ that can be disconnected from the rest of the body, and that also means that it can be centralized in the hands of someone else as property, which means that it can become a form of domination, or a basis of domination. And that is why human beings, compared to other animals, are, have this unique capacity to externalize social relations, to inscribe social relations in their material surroundings, to build infrastructures of technological infrastructure, material infrastructures, which are embodiments of social relations. And in capitalism, those relations are relations of domination. And that is why that's what economic power is. Economic power is, in contrast to ideology and violence, a form of power that addresses the subject only indirectly through organizing their surroundings in a way that forces people to do certain things. So that's how I try to explain what economic power is with reference to an analysis of human nature.
No, that's a wonderful rabbit hole, and I mean one thing that I really cherish in your book is the way that you also, how you are opening all these kind of discussions, and you are also, putting all the literature in that you skimmed for that, so people can really go into detail if they want. That's yeah, I'm looking forward to that, because that's super interesting. But let's get out of that rabbit hole and let's talk a little bit about the relations. So the second part.
Yes.
A fundamental distinction, and this is also not something that is unique to you, but you elaborate on this too, is there was elaborate again. I'm going to find a different word for that.
Oh, it's a good word.
You talk about forms of power in capitalism, or economic power, forms of economic power that you call abstract and impersonal. What do you mean by that? What's abstract and impersonal power in capitalism?
Abstract and impersonal are some of the words I use to describe how economic power works. And one of the things that's unique about capitalism is the degree to which it relies on abstract and impersonal forms of power. And so what do I mean by impersonal? I think the power of capital is impersonal in the sense that a lot of its expression cannot be attributed to specific persons. So an example could be competition, like the pressure of competition, or the price mechanism, market mechanisms. That's a good example of the impersonality of the economic power of capital. So you can't, it's not possible to point to a specific person who has taken a decision or has decided that this is how much you have to pay for these kind of things, or how much money you have to make in order to be able to survive. It's just market mechanisms, competition, or something like that, price signals. Even when it seems most personal, the power of capital, for example, in the workplace, when you're confronted with an employer or a boss that tells you how to do things, and in that case, it might seem like the power of capital is also a form of personal power. But the thing is that compared to other, to pre-capitalist modes of production, as a general rule, capitalist producers in capitalism, or workers in capitalism, are have the possibility to quit their job and to choose their own master, in a sense, right? So they don't have the opportunity to completely opt out of or to exit from the relations of dominations, but they have, you know, compared to, for example, ancient slavery, they have you know, they have the opportunity of quitting one job and taking another job, right? So and that's so what that means is that you know, as a general rule, workers are not tied to a specific capitalist, but to the capitalist class as such. And that's also another sense in which the power of capital is impersonal, even when it seems most personal in the workplace. And regarding the abstractness of the power of capital, I think that it's also abstract in the sense that often these power mechanisms, often with these mechanisms of domination, you can't identify, you know, where they come from. In that sense, it's abstract, but it's also, in a more technical sense, perhaps, it's the power of abstractions, in the sense that capitalism includes capitalism relies on a number of real abstractions that, you know, the money is an abstraction, right? Money is an abstraction, and money that's an example of an abstraction that has power or exercises power. So it's also, the power of capital is the power of real abstractions.
Right, and another distinction that you then make on another level is the idea of vertical power versus horizontal power. Can you give us this distinction?
Yes, so I borrow these expressions from Robert Brenner, and Robert Brenner, the Marxist historian, he distinguishes between, so what he calls social property relations, which is what is usually called relations of production. He distinguishes between, he says that capitalist relations of production, or social property relations in capitalism, consist of two sets of relations: the vertical relations between exploiters and exploited, between the capitalists and the workers, and the horizontal relations are the relations between units of production. And capitalism has a historically unique way of organizing both these kinds of relations. And we cannot understand capitalism by only referring to one of these sets of relations. And I think that's absolutely correct. So I kind of use those concepts to organize my analysis of the various mechanisms of economic power. And the central thing about, well, the vertical relations are class relations, and I you know, in compared to, for example, Robert Brenner or other Marxists, I try to broaden the, you know, the idea of who's at the bottom of this relation, because class relations are often, class domination in capitalism is often defined as a relationship between worker and capitalist, or the exploited in the sense of those who sell their labor power. And that's obviously an important part of class relations in capitalism. But I also think that it's important to note how the relationship between capitalists and wage laborer, the relationship between those who buy labor power and sell labor power, is actually based on a much more encompassing class relation between those who control the means of production, or the means of social reproduction, so the means of this survival of society, and those who are excluded from it. And the last category, which I would say is that's like the definition of proletarians, and that's a much more encompassing category, because it also encompasses all of those people who work outside of the wage relation, for example, who do domestic labor in the home or other places. So what I'm trying to say is basically just that capitalism relies on a specific form of class domination, where a large part of the population is excluded from access to the means of production. And that's obviously the classical Marxist analysis, and then so that's the vertical relations, the vertical one set of the two relations, that the sets of relations that define capitalist relations of production. The other set is the horizontal relations, and that's the relations between units of production. And the specific thing about capitalism is that those relations take the form of market relations, right? So that units of production are dependent upon each other because there's a division of labor, and that they coordinate their activities through the exchange of products of labor as commodities, which means that capitalism is, as we know, a society which tends to transform everything into commodities, and where commodity and the market transaction play an historically unique role in the reproduction of society and in the daily lives of almost everyone. And that generates a lot of mechanisms of domination, which everyone is subjected to. So I think that what's one of the important things about that is that it means that the power of capital cannot be reduced to the power of the capitalists or the capitalist class. So the power of capital relies on class domination, relies on the domination of proletarians by capitalists, but it also includes a lot of mechanisms of dominations which everyone, the whole society, is subjected to. So power mechanism that transcends class differences, although they affect classes in a different way, which is also important to know.
Yeah, yeah. It's not Jeff Bezos, guys. It's not Elon Musk alone. I mean, they might still be assholes, but that's not the problem. I mean, maybe we go a little bit into this. I have another question on this, which is this discussion on. I didn't use elaboration. Discussion on the Wertkritik, the value critique, maybe you would call it in English, which is let's say a German started, at least a Germany school of Marxism, which, and now I'm super reducing this, so please nobody kill me, but in my understanding, it says value is everything else beyond the value form is secondary at best. Hence also then these discussions whether class struggle is necessary in order to overcome the value form, etc., etc. And you also take a stand there and you say, well, yes and no, value is everything, but class is also everything. So kind of
yes.
This kind of dialectical relation in between those, and that you can't really separate them. Can you give us your take on this for a second?
Yes, and I think that it's the central idea that I criticize is the idea which you can find in the work of someone like Robert Kurz, Anselm Jappe, and also Moshe Postone, that the idea that class domination or class antagonisms are somehow a kind of secondary form of domination, derived from a more fundamental form of domination, which is the domination of everyone by the value form. And I think that that is wrong, because I think that Marx has some very convincing arguments that demonstrate that the value form presupposes class domination. So they always begin from the first chapters of Capital and Marx's analysis of the value form. And what they don't, in my opinion, what they don't get is that, Marx begins from the assumption that the commodity form is the general form, social form of the products of labor. So he begins from the fact that, universalization of the commodity form. And then through a series of dialectical arguments, he demonstrates how that situation actually presupposes that labor power is available as a commodity. So it presupposes that that it's possible to buy labor power on the market, and that presupposes that there's a class of people who are cut off from access to the means of their own reproduction. And in that sense, the value form presupposes class domination from the very beginning of the analysis. And I think that's what that tells us, is that the universal domination of everyone by the value form. And I think that's a great insight from those authors, that it's true that the value form is that the universalization of the commodity form generates some a number of power mechanisms, or mechanisms of domination, that everyone is subjected to. But it's important to see how that form of domination and those mechanisms actually rely on and also strengthen class domination. So basically, what I'm trying to argue is that neither of these forms of dominations are more fundamental than the other, and that in order to understand the power of capital, we need to understand both of these forms of power, and more importantly, how they mediate each other and how they interact and rely on each other.
Yeah, I really like that quote. I mean, I'm paraphrasing now, but something like, by talking about the value form in the very first chapters in Capital, he starts talking about class at the same time. So, I mean, this is also what you try to explain now, that these things kind of work in each other, and they are not just, step 1, step 2, step 3, but rather like, how to call it? That's probably his dialectical method of understanding and arguing about these items. Okay, let's skip a couple of questions because we are short on time, and let's come to dynamics. Third chapter. There you start with the term of the real subsumption. You also talk about formal subsumption versus real subsumption. Can you explain what that is, and maybe give us, and I had questions for all these examples that you go through in length in your book, but maybe we don't do that now. Maybe you can just give us an example on what real subsumption would be, and why is it important to understand real subsumption when we try to understand economic power and capital.
Yes, of course. And so the concepts of formal and real subsumption have to do with the concrete social material structure of the production process. And so Marx says that a production process is formally subsumed under capital when capital has taken over a production process from a pre-capitalist mode of production, and that where it hasn't changed the material, the concrete structure of the work, the labor process. So I think one way of understanding it is to imagine, if you imagine a farmer working on a piece of land and growing certain kinds of crops, and then imagine a situation where the state suddenly says that now this is not your land anymore, and gives it to someone else, and the farmer would then have to sell their labor power to that person and work for that person, and that would be like a formal change, in the sense that you can imagine that the farmer still works on the same piece of land and grows the same crops with the same tools, but now it's not the farmer's property but someone else's property. That would be a formally subsumed labor process, because the concrete character of the labor process would be the same. So it would be formally subsumed under capital. But what then happens when capital takes over a production process is that because of competitive pressures and so on, the capitalist has to constantly improve production in order to stay competitive, and that involves the constant material restructuring of the production process by introducing new technologies, for example, new ways of new divisions of labor within the labor process, the production process. New forms of surveillance or control and discipline of workers and so on. So all of those material reorganizations of the production process according to the logic of capital, or in order to increase the profitability of the production process. That's what Marx calls real subsumption. So a really subsumed labor process is a labor process where the material structure of the labor process is a result of the logic of capital. So it's basically a concept that he uses to describe how capital constantly remolds the material structure of production processes on a number of different levels, because that happens on the level of the labor process, as I just described, for example, by introducing new technologies and new production techniques, new ways of new forms of discipline, or new ways of organizing the labor process. But it also happens in capital's relationship to nature. Capital also actively reorganizes natural processes in order to increase profitability. So, for example, by biotechnological manipulation of plants, animals, and so on, and also by altering the landscape, for example, through infrastructural projects. And we could come up with a lot of examples of how capital reshapes natural processes in order to make money. And it also happens on not just the workplace level and the labor process, not just in the capital's relationship to nature, but also on the level of the totality and the geographical relationship between different parts of the global economy. So the spatial reorganization of production is also a form of real subsumption, I would argue, where capital actively reorganizes the material structure of production in order to increase its grip on social life by, for example, through infrastructural projects, through highways or ports, or and transport technologies and so on. And all of these are examples of, in a sense, we could say that they are examples of capital materializing itself in our surroundings, and that's a question of power, because it means that gradually capital creates a world in its own picture, and that makes it more and more difficult, I would argue, to make like a transformation from a capitalist mode of production to something else. So I think it would have been easier to exit from capitalism 100 years ago than it is now, because, for example, we have today like an international division of labor where you might have large areas that only produce one or two or crops or something like that. So you would have to reorganize like the entire agricultural production, and that's a consequence of the real subsumption of the production process.
I think it was David Harvey. You quote him also a couple of times in your book, but I've heard him talk. Like he has this one take on that we don't really want capitalism to end tomorrow, because if we do, if it were to end tomorrow, then most people on the planet would be in absolute misery. They wouldn't get their food anymore. They wouldn't get their commodities or their subsistence basically anymore, because the global system is so intertwined that it's quite difficult for us to just take that over and organize that consciously. At least that's what he says. But yeah, I do see that too. Okay, that's great. So we have to consider real subsumption and how it changed. And by the way, 1917, guys, we should have changed it then. Now it's more difficult. But there is another thing that you basically close your argument with the book, which is how crises and how the surplus population, so basically what Marx calls the surplus population that capital produces, also plays a role in exerting economic power of capital. maybe as a last point before we close, can you explain a little bit about what crisis and unemployment have to do with that?
Yes, of course. So the theory of relative surplus population is a theory of how capitalism implies certain economic mechanisms that guarantee that there's always a certain level of unemployment. And that means that that is a power mechanism, or a mechanism of domination, because unemployment, the existence of unemployment, makes it easier to discipline workers, because it makes it possible to threaten them with firing them and hiring someone else. And it makes it easier to depress wages and so on. So it strengthens the power of capital. So that's why I think that the theory of relative surplus population tells us something about, that's also an example of the abstract and impersonal forms of domination that capital relies on. Regarding the question of crises, in contrast to most of the Marxist discussions about crisis, I'm not first of all interested in the causes of crises. I'm more interested in the effects of crises. And some Marxists have tended to regard crises as as a particularly weak situation for capital, as a revolutionary opening. And while that can, in certain circumstances, be true, I think I also think that we should pay more attention to how crises often helps to re-establish the conditions for a new round of accumulation. So, and it's not, my argument is not that economic crises can be reduced to a kind of internal self-regulating mechanisms of capitalism. It's not only that, but it's also that, I think. It's also, and it's a risky way of re-establishing, it's a risky solution to the internal contradictions of the capitalist mode of production. So crises inevitably happen because capitalism is a contradictory economic system. But crises are also the way in which capitalism overcomes these contradictions and creates the conditions for a new round of accumulation. And crises tend to result or crises tend to strengthen the power of capital in some ways, because, for example, it often leads to companies closing, which leads to rising unemployment levels, an increase in unemployment levels, which makes it easier to discipline workers and leads to depressing of wages, for example. And it also generates a pressure to expand, to commodify new areas of human life, or new, to expand capitalist production in general. So I think that we should also view crisis as a mechanism of domination. And I think there are a lot of historical examples from the history of capitalism that supports this conclusion, that often crises do not end in revolutions, but in capitalist expansion, actually.
Yeah, historically, nearly every time. Yeah, until now. Maybe the next crisis is the last one. Let's see. All right. So, of course, I have many, many more questions, but we are nearing the end. So I'm going to ask you the meanest one in the end. When I wrote my thesis, the question that I hated the most is if somebody asked me to summarize what I was writing on. If you were to summarize the most important learnings, like the things that you personally have learned during your research, like can you, and what would those be?
Yes, I think I would say that the most important conclusion is that capitalism relies not only on violence and ideology, but also on a form of power which is immediately embedded in the economic processes themselves, and that are abstract and anonymous forms of domination. That's the most important conclusion, I think.
Excellent. That was shorter than expected, so we have a bit more time. So I want to ask you one more question. No, it's not really a question. It's more like a pitch. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your upcoming works. There is this project coming, a philosophical anthropology for the capitalist scene. And maybe how this is related to what you've been doing before on Mute Compulsion.
Yes, well, I'm in the very early stages of that project. So I don't have a lot to say yet, but it's connected to my project on Mute Compulsion in the way that it's basically a kind of extension of the parts of the book dealing with the human body and I spoke about that earlier today, about the unique human relationship to the rest of nature. And so I'm trying to develop a Marxist contribution to what has been called the corporeal turn in humanities and social sciences in the last couple of decades. So there has been written a lot about the body and a lot of good theories about the body from a lot of non-Marxist perspectives, and I think they have that is a good thing, and I think that. But I also think that Marxism has something to say and something to contribute to those discussions, especially, and I think that Marx's writings about the human body, thoughts on the human body and human tool use, actually has the potential for developing a theory of the corporeal roots of human historicity and freedom. So that's some of the things that I'm going to work on, which is a bit more philosophical, I guess. But a part of the project is also to examine how capitalism reproduces and relies on different hierarchies of bodies. So that's also a part of the project.
Is there going to be another book, or like a series of articles? So you don't know yet.
I hope so. Yeah, I hope it would result in a book, which would be something like a Marxist theory of the body. Yes.
I'm looking forward to reading that one, especially after this here, everyone. Mute Compulsion, Stummer Zwang, in Beats Verlag. Mute Compulsion in Verso Books, I think, right?
Yes, in November this year.
November this year, okay. Søren Mau, thanks a lot for being here. We only scratched the surface of this book. You should definitely get it. Definitely read it a couple of times. Thanks again for being here. Thanks for your time. And I hope you can visit us soon again, and maybe we talk about your next project then.
I would love to do that. Thank you.
Have a nice evening, Søren, and talk to you soon. And to everybody else, have a nice evening and see you later. Leute, wir brauchen eure Hilfe. Wenn euch dieses Video gefallen hat, klickt auf Like, abonniert den Kanal und vergesst nicht das Glöckchen zu drücken, damit ihr benachrichtigt werdet, wenn wir neuen Content droppen.
Außerdem solltet ihr uns überall folgen, wo wir verfügbar sind. Das ist Facebook, Instagram, Twitter und Twitch. Und wenn wir irgendwelche Ankündigungen machen oder Posts, dann shared, was das Zeug hält. Gebt uns all eure Liebe.
Wir haben mittlerweile ziemlich signifikante Kosten. Wenn ihr es euch irgendwie leisten könnt, unterstützt uns doch auf Patreon. Dann kommt ihr auch in den Genuss verschiedener Vorteile, wie zum Beispiel Zugang zu unserer Discord-Community oder Zugang zu den ultrageheimen Patreon-Episoden, die wir dort posten. Außerdem könnt ihr uns natürlich auch über PayPal digital Spenden zukommen lassen.
Außerdem haben wir mittlerweile einen eigenen Online-Shop. Das heißt, wenn ihr euch immer noch fragt, was ihr euren Lieben zu Weihnachten, Ostern oder sonst wie schenken könnt, geht dorthin und kauft duftes Merch.
Alle Links dazu hier in der Beschreibung oder auch auf unserer Webseite 99zu1.de.
Vielen Dank fürs Dabeisein, danke für die Unterstützung und wir sehen uns in diesem Theater.